Chapter 2. How your long-term memory works. In the last chapter, I described how your working short-term memory takes in new information and then passes some of it onto your long-term memory. In this chapter, I'll describe how your long-term memory works, so you will better understand the techniques used for putting information into your long-term memory, and later, retrieving information from there. Again, I have drawn on the latest findings from cognitive psychologists in writing this chapter. You might think of your long-term memory as akin to a hard drive on a computer, whereas your working memory is like your RAM, random access memory, which you use in processing current tasks and which has only a limited space. Your long-term memory is very large, and contains everything you've ever put into it, from experiences to images and information. You may have to do some digging around to find specific information. Sometimes, as when you're struggling to recall something you haven't thought about for a very long time, you may think certain information has been deleted, but it may well be there if you know how to retrieve it. The 3 types of long-term memory. Commonly, psychologists divide long-term memory into 3 types of memory, although this may be more of a convenience for thinking about how we remember than actual distinctions. However, different techniques will help you improve in each of these areas, so these distinctions have practical uses. These 3 types of memory include episodic, semantic, and procedural memory, which have the following characteristics discussed below. 1. Episodic memory. This is your memory for experiences or events that happened to you at any time in the past, from many years ago to just a few minutes ago. When you call up these memories, you travel backwards in time so you can experience what happened in the past, or at least what you remember happened, since this recollection is subjective. 2. Thus, someone else might have a different memory of what happened and a video recording might show a still different reality. So while your memory may well be accurate, it is also subject to distortion for various reasons, such as your faulty encoding of this memory in the first place or a later modification of the memory to conform to your self-perception of how you are now. Then, 2, your memory might be modified by later suggestions about what you experienced. This sometimes happens in conversations and interviews, as when a cop interviews a witness or suspect with leading questions that shape what the person remembers. You'll see some techniques for how to more accurately pull up these memories in chapters 24 and 26. Semantic memory. This is your memory for what you know about the world. It is like an organized base of knowledge. It includes any factual or other information you have learned, including all the words you know in any language. 3. You might think of this semantic memory as your internal encyclopedia or reference desk, which you are continually consulting as you speak, read the newspaper, listen to the radio or TV, or consider the validity of new information from any source. And just as your episodic memory can be faulty at times, so can your semantic memory. Procedural memory. This is your memory for your knowledge about how to do something. 4. Commonly, once this knowledge gets transferred into your long-term memory, it becomes automatic. You don't have to think about driving a car, for example, or opening up a word processing program and starting to type. But like any skill, if you don't use it, you can forget exactly what you are doing, much like any unused mechanical device might become rusty or a computer program might become corrupted and stop working properly. Encoding your memories. Regardless of which type of memory you are placing in long-term memory, the transfer process from working to long-term memory depends on encoding, the action of placing a particular bit of information there. The process is a little like placing a file folder, in which you have just placed some documents, into a file cabinet. The more carefully you place it there and the more clearly you identify what's in that file, the better you will be able to retrieve it later. In fact, psychologists distinguish between 2 types of encoding. Psychologists call this the levels of processing, or depth of processing. You can either encode something through a more shallow type of encoding or a deeper level of processing. 5. The difference affects your ability to retrieve information later. When you use a more shallow type of processing, you are essentially using your senses to place the information in long-term memory. For example, You are focusing on the way a word or image looks or sounds. In the test psychologists use for testing memory, this appearance or sound might be distinguished by whether a word is typed in capital or small letters, rhymes with another word, or comes before or after another word in a sequence. In the case of an image, your focus would be on its appearance, such as its shape, color, or identity. Or in everyday life, you might do shallow processing when you remember someone by his or her facial features or what he or she is wearing. By contrast, when you use a deep processing approach, you are looking at the meaning of something. For instance, if it's a word, you might think of whether it fits in a sentence or what types of images and associations it brings to mind. If it's an image, you would think about its associations, too. And in everyday life, you would seek to remember more details about someone beyond his or her superficial appearance, such as his or her occupation, where and how you met, and your thoughts about how you might be able to have a mutually profitable relationship in the future. As psychologists have found, when you use deep processing to remember something, you will better recall it later. Why? Because of two key factors: 1. Making the information more distinctive, and 2. Elaborating on it. 6. For example, you might make the name of someone you have just met more distinctive by identifying something unusual about that name or thinking about how that person is unique, such as if that person has an unusual occupation. Or you might elaborate on some new information by thinking about how it connects to something else you already know or about its meaning and significance, such as when you read a news article and think about the impact that an event discussed in the article will have. In addition, psychologists have discovered 3 other factors that contribute to deeper encoding and therefore better retrieval. 1. The self-referent effect, 2. The power of context and specificity, and 3. The influence of the emotions and mood. Moreover, psychologists have found that these deeper encoding processes make more of an impact within the brain itself than shallower processing. For example, they have found that when subjects in experiments engage in deep processing, they activate the left prefrontal cortex, which is associated with verbal and language processing. 7. This deep processing approach has also been found to be especially effective in trying to remember faces, by paying more attention to the distinctions between features and consciously trying to recall more facial features. 8. You'll see more about techniques that are based on each of these factors in subsequent chapters. But for now, here's how these different factors contribute to better remembering something. Using the self-referent effect for a better memory. The way the self-referent effect works is that if you can relate the information to yourself, you will better remember it. Psychologists have found this association again and again, when they have asked subjects to decide if a particular word could apply to themselves, rather than just trying to remember the word based on how it looks or sounds, or on its meaning. 9. One reason is that as you think about how something relates to you, you make it more distinctive and you elaborate on what that word means to you. The same process works when you think about anything, such as how someone you have just met might be able to help you or how you might be able to use a new product you are reading about in your own life. As you think about it, you make that information more distinctive and you elaborate on it by considering what it means to you. You might also be more likely to continue to think about it, a process that psychologists call rehearsal, as you repeatedly call up a new idea, name, or any other sort of new information. Intriguingly, psychologists have found that this self-reference approach lights up a particular area of the brain, the right prefrontal cortex, which researchers suggest may be an area of the brain associated with the concept of self. 10. So as you use these various techniques for deep processing, such as finding ways to increase the way a particular bit of information relates to you, it has a direct effect on your brain processing, too. No wonder these techniques work so well. You are not only creating more meanings and associations for words and relating them to yourself, but your actions are activating your brain centers involved with language and your sense of self. Using the power of context and specificity. Another way to increase your encoding ability is to incorporate the specific context, and then use that context when you seek to retrieve that memory. 11. A good example of how the power of context works is when you meet someone at an event and later you run into that person dressed differently on the street. You may not even recognize the person, or you may only have a vague sense of familiarity. You think you may have seen that person before, but you don't have the slightest idea where. But if the other person has a better memory for your meeting and mentions where you met, the memory of who that person is may come flooding back. Why? Because you now have the context for your meeting, which cues you into who this person is and what transpired in your meeting. A similar kind of experience may occur when you go to get something from another room, but once you get there, you don't have any idea why you are there. No, you are not suffering the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. You have simply moved out of the context in which you encoded the item and remembered why you need it. In a different context, you don't remember what you were looking for. But once you return to the original room, you will remember. Psychologists have developed some terms that highlight the importance of context for remembering. One is the encoding specificity principle, which means that you will better recall something if you are in a context that's similar to where you encoded the information, that is, when you entered it into your long-term memory. 12. By contrast, you are more likely to forget when you experience a different context. Two other terms that psychologists use to refer to this phenomenon are that your memory is context-dependent, or that transfer-appropriate processing helps you better remember. 13. In other words, if you are having trouble remembering something, it can help to go back into the setting where you first encoded it into memory. Or if you can't actually go there, you can mentally project yourself into that setting, one of the techniques I'll discuss further in chapters 24 and 26. Repeatedly, psychologists have found examples of this encoding specificity principle in their research, in which memory is dependent on the context where the original memory is encoded. For example, they found that people hearing a male or female speak some words were more likely to remember the word when they heard the words spoken again by someone of the same sex. 14. They have also found that subjects will recall an earlier experience in extensive detail when triggered by a present-day stimulus that evokes that experience. For example, an image of an exotic bird you haven't seen in years brings back memories of going on a birding trip to the tropics. While the physical context can serve as a reminder, so can the mental context, because it's not just how the environment looks but how it feels. 15. For example, you may experience an extremely hot day in one place that brings up memories of how you felt when it was extremely hot someplace else. A bitter cold day now can bring up memories of a bitter cold winter long ago. The influence of emotion and mood. Finally, cognitive psychologists have found that your emotional feelings and mood can affect what you remember. Not only is there the same kind of matching effect that there is for context, so you will remember more if you are in a similar emotional state when you try to retrieve a memory, but you will remember more if you feel the memory is a pleasant one. 16. Here are 3 major findings about memory, emotions, and mood. You will recall pleasant information more accurately and more quickly, which is sometimes called the Pollyanna principle. Whether you are trying to remember what you have perceived, what someone has said, a decision you have made, or other types of information, if it's more pleasant to remember, you will remember better. While psychologists have tested this principle in the laboratory, such as by asking subjects to remember words that are pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant, or asking them to remember colors, fruits, vegetables, or other items that are more or less pleasant. 17. The principle makes sense in everyday life. For example, wouldn't you rather recall something you enjoy that gives you good feelings than something you don't like and makes you feel bad? In fact, there is a whole body of research that indicates that people will repress or suppress memories of experiences that are unpleasant, such as memories of early childhood abuse. 18. You will more accurately recall neutral information associated with pleasant information or a pleasant context, or as psychologists phrase it, you will have more accurate recall for neutral stimuli associated with pleasant stimuli. 19. Psychologists have come to this conclusion by making comparisons in the lab, such as whether subjects better remember commercials or the brands featured in them when they see them before or after violent and non-violent films. Again and again, psychologists have found significantly better recall when non-violent, and presumably more pleasant, films are shown. 20. The finding makes perfect sense, and you can see examples of how this works in everyday life. For example, when you are experiencing or seeing something pleasant, you will feel more comfortable and relaxed, which will contribute to your remembering something you read, hear, or perceive in this relaxed state. By contrast, if you are experiencing something unpleasant, you will feel more stress and tension. The experience may even interfere with your ability to concentrate, such as by distracting your attention, so you encode and remember less. You will retain your pleasant memories longer, while unpleasant memories will fade faster. It's a principle some researchers discovered when they asked subjects to record personal events for about 3 months and rate how pleasant they were, and 3 months later, asked them to rate the events again. While there was little change for the neutral and pleasant events, most of the subjects rated the less pleasant events as more pleasant when they recalled them again. The one unexpected finding was that if subjects tended to feel depressed, they were more likely to better recall the unpleasant memories. 21. But this finding makes sense when you think about it. You are more likely to focus on and remember the experiences you have found pleasant in your life, since they will make you feel better. But if you are unhappy, you will be more likely to recall the negative, unpleasant experiences you have had, though these will contribute to keeping you feeling down. Cognitive psychologists have additionally found that just as there is improved memory when the context matches, so there is a match between what you remember and your mood. If you are in a good mood, you will remember pleasant material better than unpleasant material, while if you are in a bad mood, you will better remember unpleasant material. Likewise, if you are a generally upbeat person, your memory for positive information will be greater than the memory of someone who tends to be down and depressed. In turn, these positive memories will help keep someone who is positive upbeat, while a depressed person could become even more down in the dumps as they remember more negative memories. 22. In other words, as the old popular song puts it, accentuate the positive in what you think about and remember if you want to feel better. Retrieving your memories. Once a memory is encoded in long-term memory, there are several ways to retrieve it, and many of the techniques described in later chapters will help you do that. Psychologists distinguish between 2 ways of looking at how well you retrieve a memory, either explicitly through recall or recognition, or implicitly, when your memory enables you to do some activity, even though you aren't consciously trying to remember how to do it. 23. Your recall is your ability to call up a particular memory. Your recognition is your ability to recognize whether or not you know or are familiar with something. As you well know from your own experience, it's always more difficult to recall something than to simply recognize it as being familiar. This is the difference between having to come up with a definition or identification for something on a test versus selecting a multiple choice or true/false answer. One way that psychologists test for recall ability, an approach that will be incorporated in some later exercises for memory improvement, is asking subjects to read a list of words, then take a break, and later try to write down as many words as they can. Or they might do this exercise with numbers, nonsense syllables, cities, animal names, or anything else they choose. They test for recognition in a very similar way. Subjects are given a list of words or other items and, after a break, are shown another list and asked to identify the items on the original list. 24. In both recall and recognition, errors can easily creep in, such as not remembering an item on a list or thinking that something is on the list that isn't. As for implicit memory, a typical example of testing for this ability is to give subjects in an experiment a list of items with some information left out, such as having missing letters in words or having some missing lines in a drawing. 25. Then, the subjects have to fill in what's missing. If they have seen the words, drawings, or other items in the test before, they will be able to complete the items more quickly and accurately, because they have a memory of seeing those items before. Whatever the type of task, if you have previous experience with the material or skill involved, you will be able to do it better. For example, even if you haven't ridden a bike, picked up a tennis racket, or spoken a language you learned in college for many years, you will generally find if you are in a situation where you have to use that skill again, you will be able to use it even if you are a little rusty. When you work on learning and remembering that ability again, you will learn it faster than you did the first time. Moreover, if your experience is more recent, you will be more likely to recall, recognize, or use an implicit memory to complete a task. So it makes sense to refresh your memory closer to the time when you will need it, otherwise, a good recollection of something may not be there when you need it. For example, a woman in a Native American literature class once thought she would get a leg up on the course if she read over the material the first night after the class. But when it came time to take a short quiz on the reading, she completely blanked out on the stories. However, when the professor discussed the books later in the course, she found the material familiar. That loss of memory is what happens if you learn something too far away in time from when you need to recall that information and don't try to refresh your memory closer to the time you need to know this material. Your memory of something you have learned gradually fades if you don't use that memory. So while you may be able to recognize that you learned something days later or may be able to pull up relevant information with a specific trigger word, phrase, or sentence, a more general recall task will leave you blank. As you'll learn in subsequent chapters, there are strategies to use in order to freshen up selective memories and decide when to learn what you need to know. Another complication to storing and retrieving new information is that when you learn something, what you have previously learned may interfere with learning something new. Psychologists call this proactive interference, and there can be even more interference when the two things you are trying to learn are similar. 26. Your previous memories interfere with what you are learning now. For instance, you meet a woman named Angie at a party and you already know an Annie. You might mistakenly call Angie, Annie, and even if you are corrected, you may continue to make that same mistake. Or say you are trying to learn about the new regulations affecting your insurance policy. You may find your memory of the old policy interfering, so you confuse the two. Improving your memory will help you deal with this proactive interference problem. Incidentally, don't confuse proactive interference, which is a problem when past learning interferes with future learning, with proactive listening and observing, which is something you want to do so you more actively learn something when you listen or look closely. How do the experts do it? Given all these difficulties in retrieving a memory correctly, from improper coding and distortion to interference from previous memories, how do the memory experts do it? What tricks and techniques do they use to make them so much better? First of all, if it makes you feel any better, experts are generally experts in a particular area, where they have studied the subject matter intensively. In other words, most experts gain their skill through extensive training and practice. As Matlin notes of the many experts studied who have great memories for chess, sports, maps, and musical notations, in general, researchers have found a strong positive correlation between knowledge about an area and memory performance in that area, and people who are expert in one area seldom display outstanding general memory skills. 27. For example, researchers have found that chess masters may be experts in remembering chess positions and some are even able to hold the positions on multiple boards in their head, but they are similar to non-experts in the general cognitive and perceptual abilities. Moreover, memory experts don't have exceptionally high scores on intelligence tests. Researchers even found that one horse racing expert only had an IQ of 92 and an 8th grade education. 28. Rather, what makes these memory experts so good at what they do is that they have become especially knowledgeable and practiced in a particular area, so you can do it, too. In particular, researchers have found that memory experts have these key traits, and you'll find some techniques drawn from these findings in later chapters. Memory experts have a well-organized structure of knowledge, which they have carefully learned in a particular field. 29. The experts generally use more vivid imagery to help them remember. The experts are more likely to organize any new material they have to recall into organized and meaningful chunks of information. The experts use special rehearsal techniques when they practice, such as focusing on particular words or images that are likely to help them remember the rest of that material. They don't try to remember everything. The experts more effectively can fill in the blanks when they have missing information in material they have partially learned and remembered, such as when they are able to fill in the rest of a story they are recalling and recounting to others. These techniques, in turn, work well for anyone, such as professional speakers and actors, who have to encode and remember a lot of information in their field, and these are techniques you can use, too. For example, professional actors use deeper rather than superficial processing techniques, such as thinking about the meanings and motivations of the character they are portraying. They also use visualization to see the person with whom they are talking as they practice their lines, and they try to put themselves in the appropriate mood and think about how the story relates to themselves. 30. In short, they don't just try to remember a lot of lines by rote, but they create a rich context for encoding and later retrieving the memory of their lines. Remembering what you experienced. Finally, there is one other area of long-term memory that has been much studied by researchers, an area that cognitive psychologists call autobiographical memory. 31. It includes not only long-ago personal experiences, but also your observations when you witness a major event, such as a crime. Commonly, this kind of memory includes a narrative or story about the event that you relate. But it additionally includes all sorts of elaborations that contribute to the significance of the story, such as the imagery you associate with the event and your emotional reactions to it. These memories also contribute to creating your personal identity, history, and sense of self, because they are all about what you experienced. Researchers are especially interested in looking at how well these autobiographical memories match what really happened. In other words, is your recall correct? What is especially interesting about this type of memory is the way errors can creep in, so you have distorted memories or remember things that didn't even happen, even though your memory assures you that you really were there. You may make such mistakes for various reasons. One reason is you want to keep your memories consistent with your own current self-image or your current perceptions of the person involved. Another reason is that you may find something about the memory painful, so you would rather not recall it or want to edit out the painful parts from the past. In general, though, as researchers have found, your memory is accurate in remembering what's central to the event. By contrast, you are more likely to make mistakes in correctly recalling less important details or specific small bits of tangential information. As Matlin notes, citing a study by R. Sutherland and H. Hayes, when people do make mistakes, they generally concern peripheral details and specific information about commonplace events, rather than central information about important events. 32. In fact, researchers have found it's better not to try to remember a lot of small details. That's where you are more likely to make mistakes. Such mistakes can also occur when you have what researchers call a flashbulb memory, which occurs in a situation where you initially are involved in, learn of, or observe an event that is very unusual, surprising, or emotionally arousing. It's called a flashbulb memory because it may be especially vivid, such as a shocking event like 9/11, some especially good news, or the accidental death of someone close to you. Typically, you are likely to recall exactly where you were, what happened during the event, what you were doing when you heard the news, who told you, your own feelings about the event, and what happened afterwards. Yet, while the very vividness and distinctiveness of the incident may lead you to remember it in more detail and with more accuracy than everyday events, particularly when you talk about it more with others, think about it more, and consider how the event affects you, you may still make mistakes. One source of confusion may be the comments and reactions of others, which may shape your own experience and how you remember that experience. Then, too, many details may fade over time. Another type of error that can creep into any kind of autobiographical memory is what researchers call consistency bias, our tendency to make what happened in the past more consistent with our current feelings, beliefs, and general knowledge or expectations about the way things are. 33. This overall outlook we have for seeing the world is what cognitive psychologists call our schema, our generalized knowledge or expectation from past experiences with an event, object, or person that influences our perception and response now. 34. Thus, we may tend to downplay what seems inconsistent with who we are now, or who we think others to be. For example, if you really like your Aunt Mildred and think she is a cool person to be around, you may tend to diminish or forget your feelings that she used to treat you badly when you were young. Or if you have become a solid conservative citizen now, you may tend to downplay or forget many times when you were a spacey liberal activist in the past. Thus, when you use memory recall techniques to tap into your personal autobiography, you have to pay careful attention so you can distinguish what you really do remember and what you might have added to or subtracted from your memory of that experience later. This caution is especially applicable when it comes to eyewitness reports. You may think you have accurately seen something, but you really haven't. There's a classic test that teachers sometimes do with students where they have one or two people suddenly come into the class and do something dramatic, like one person chasing another with a gun, or they have a mock fight, and then run out of the room. The teacher will then ask the students what they recall, and typically there are mistakes in identifications. The wrong person is seen holding the gun, the students think the man with the mustache is clean-shaven, and so on. No wonder that researchers have found that in over half the cases where defendants have been mistakenly convicted, it's because of faulty eyewitness testimony. 35. One reason that eyewitness memories are often faulty is because of what researchers call the misinformation effect, which occurs when people are given incorrect information about what they have observed and they later recall the incorrect information rather than what they actually saw. 36. This disruption is due to what cognitive psychologists call retroactive interference, which occurs when recently learned new material interferes with recalling a previous memory correctly. For example, you see something very clearly, but then someone provides misinformation in asking you a question. Later you can't remember what you initially observed because you are recalling the new information, or you are confused about what you really saw. 37. A good example of this retroactive interference is when a lawyer or cop is interviewing a witness who has seen a crime occur and asks what happened when he or she saw the person holding a gun. Maybe the accused person didn't have a gun at all, but the witness will now remember him holding a gun. And so a false memory is born. In fact, there have been cases where individuals have come to believe that they committed a crime under intensive questioning. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was an explosion of false memories that occurred when individuals reported early memories of childhood abuse that they had forgotten or repressed. While some of these reports were valid, in many cases they were remembering imagined memories, sometimes suggested by therapists or because of the influence of recovered memory therapy groups. A similar situation has occurred in the more recent priest-child abuse cases involving young males, where some accusers have recalled long repressed memories while others have remembered events that never happened. The reason for these recovered false memories is that sometimes therapists probing for reasons for a person's current problem will make suggestions while asking their questions. Then clients can come to believe that they do remember something, which memory becomes elaborated through further therapy, hypnosis, and interactions with other clients who are recovering their own memories. Indeed, cognitive psychologists are able to produce false memories in the lab. For example, they will give the subject a list containing a family of related words, such as water, stream, lake, boat, swim, and later the subject comes up with a related word, e.g., river, that wasn't on the original list. 38. So the subjects are creating their own false memories through their active imagination. So what can you do to remember past events in your life more accurately? How do you avoid the effects of suggestion, retroactive interference, and misinformation distorting a past memory or creating a new one that you think occurred in the past. You'll see some suggested ways to improve your autobiographical memory in Chapter 17 on remembering a story, as well as in Chapters 24 and 26.